Awesome. Hello and welcome. We're delighted to have you join us. My name is Amber Bryant, and I'm the project manager for the Partnership for Expanding Education Research in STEM, PEERS, Data Hub at the University of Michigan. The PEERS Data Hub is funded by the National Science Foundation and is a collaborative initiative between the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, here at the University of Michigan. The PEERS Data Hub features ways to explore and discover data sets for secondary research and analysis, avenues for connecting with colleagues and like-minded researchers, and resources for data management and your research project. If you would like to know more and also register for upcoming webinars, please visit the PEERS Data Hub website at www.peersdatahub.net. A few quick technical notes before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded, and when the recording and slides are available, a message will be sent to you via email within about 2 weeks. We hope this doesn't happen, but if the webinar were to close unexpectedly, please reopen it from the link you used to attend this presentation. We welcome your questions. Please type in questions at any time using the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom window. A live transcript is also available. To show or hide that transcript, click the up arrow on the live transcript button. Please note, for those who are viewing on a phone or a tablet, the Zoom app currently highlights only the active speaker. The live transcript will still be available. You may need to scroll to the left or the right to see the presenter or the presentation. For privacy, all participants are in listen-only mode, with microphones muted, and chat between participants is limited. One last note, if you are posting to social media about what you learned here, please use hashtag PeersDataHub. Once again, this webinar will be recorded and a link will be sent to your email that you use for registration. Okay, let's get started. Today, we are hearing from 4 scholars who teach and work in education research. First, we will hear from Pamela Davis-Kean, a professor of psychology and research professor at the University of Michigan for the Institute for Social Research. She will be talking with us today about the broader context of open science practices. After that, we will hear from Jessica Spybrook, professor of evaluation, measurement, and research at Western Michigan University, who will be talking to us about the Registry of Efficacy and Effectiveness Studies, REESE, and its various benefits. Lastly, our final speaker will be Katharine Meyer, a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University, who will be discussing with us how pre-registering a study fits into the research workflow. I would like to say thank you in advance to all of our speakers, as well as our IT support, and I look forward to a lively discussion. I will include the agenda in the chat for your convenience as well. All right, Dr. Davis-Kean, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Amber. It's exciting to see everybody who's here today. Let's see, get my screen up. I'm going to be giving an overview of pre-registration and why it's important and has come up as a kind of primary issue. Sorry, there we go. In both psychology, education, pretty much all sciences that we're looking at. I also want to note that these slides are available from the Center for Open Science. So they're standard, and you can look and see how people have added to them. I have a few additions to the ones they have, but this is basically a standard set of slides talking about how one would go about thinking about pre-registration. So first, why are we even talking about the issue of pre-registration? Why would it be useful? So in this graphic, what you see is that generally it's the timeline of how we think about doing research. We generate our hypotheses. This is the standard. This is what we train our students to do. generate and specify hypotheses or research questions, design the study, conduct the study, and collect data, analyze the data and test your hypotheses, interpret them, and then publish them. So what's happened across the last 3 decades is that the scientific kind of timeline has had issues show up. So for example, on generating and specifying hypotheses or research questions, we don't control for biases. When we design studies, we often have studies that are designed with such low statistical power. So we're talking about data sets that are 30 people and less, that the kind of questions you're asking can't even be looked at with the statistics we have. And so that's problematic and will lead to one of the further problems we have later on. Conduct study, collect data. We often have poor quality control, so the way the data is coming in. Sometimes our protocols are not done exactly the way they are, and when they're not done that way, we're not specifying that the protocols were not done, and then we are comparing it to other studies where the protocols may have been done differently or more standardized. But we're not noting that, and people who are reviewing this paper don't know that that's the issue. Then we get to the analysis data and test hypotheses. This is where low statistical power can be a real problem. If you don't have enough statistical power, but yet you want to find a p-value of at least 0.05 and you can't find it, then a lot of people start just testing their data until they find a p-value of 0.05. And this is what we've termed p-hacking, or what lots of people talk about as being p-hacking. So that you're doing multiple testing, you're not correcting for that multiple testing. Then when you go to interpret the results, you're inappropriately interpreting them as having significant effects when it was just by probability's sake, the fact that you found a significant finding. It's not a true significant finding. So you've made a type 1 error, and then you go and publish, and on these publications of these just kind of slightly over 0.05 or slightly significant, we now only have papers in our literature that have met that criteria, because those that are not significant often don't get accepted. And then we have a little line in here that's called harking, and a lot of people don't understand what harking is. It's called hypothesizing after the research question is known. And that issue is where at first you had hypotheses, you designed your study, you didn't find what you were hoping to find significant. So then you found something significant, and then you went back and you rewrote your hypotheses as if that's what you were intending to find. So again, manipulating the data in a backward way, that maybe you did start off or you were just searching the data and then you wrote a paper as if you had those hypotheses, even though those hypotheses are being written after you know what the findings actually are. This is the issues of which we've been dealing with when we've been talking about the issues of scientific rigor and robustness, and the issues of replication, that now much of our sciences have these as issues, and part of pre-registration is attempting to address all of these issues so that we have a very clear outline of how the study was done, why it was done, decisions that were being made, kind of research practices that were done, so that we can replicate the study in the future and understand how rigorous or not rigorous the study is. So I talked about this, the combination of a strong bias towards statistically significant findings and flexibility in data analysis has resulted in us being unable to replicate research. So this has been a real problem. So again, trying very hard to just achieve that p less than 0.05 has led us to have very biased data. We don't know what the other side of the distribution is for null findings. All we know are the findings that ended up getting published. We don't know all of the studies that were done that didn't get published, that did not find significant findings. So we have no idea what the actual kind of average effect size is. And again, this flexibility in data analysis of just continuing to analyze your data until you find that star, that p less than 0.05, has led us to being unable to then somebody else take your paper and replicate the finding, because you have not logged all of those decisions that you made or all of those different multiple analyses that you did to get your findings. So we're unable to find the same thing you found. This is just kind of a description of the hierarchy of positive results across, and we probably have a lot of people from education, but this is just kind of from lots of different areas. How often do we find these kind of reports of significant findings? And you can see psychology finding them quite a lot in an area which should find things relatively few times are finding them quite a lot, and a lot of the education research falls into this issue as well. So again, positive results, more positive results than you might expect with some of what people often refer to as life sciences, or more of the applied ones, finding them less often than we are finding them in psychology. So the combination, again, toward the strong bias and flexible data analysis can, oh, sorry, same thing. So I wanted to talk to you about, Andrew Gelman is pretty famous for talking about these different forking paths that happen when you do research. So first you start off with this hypothesis that X affects Y. And then you think about, did you control for time? Did you exclude outliers? Did you look at the median? Did you look at the mean? These are all like important questions as you're approaching your question, what you're looking at. But then you end up at this statistical significant finding. But along the way, you started off with a specific hypothesis. It should follow a relatively linear line. But instead, all of these decisions you made along the way, did you exclude outliers? Did you keep them in? Did you look at time? Did you control for age? Did you control for groups? Did you decide to look at the median, the mean? How many tests did you run? Well, now all of a sudden you have these forking paths to different ways to get different answers. And if you have this many different answers, then it's very hard to figure out how the research that started off with a hypothesis or research question of this if X affects Y, kind of what happened in between. And so this was a graphical description of how confusing it can get if we don't understand exactly how you went about it, coming up with your question and then doing the research design and following through in order to answer that question. I don't know why that keeps showing up. So I just wanted to show again that the Reproducibility Project, so this was one of the first attempts to say how much literature out there can we reproduce. That we found. So a lot of this was done in social psychology. It's been just recently came out in cancer research. So this has been done across a lot of different sciences now, but it started in the personality and social psychology, where they were looking at the original studies and the p-values. So all of these p-values were significant. Again, this is publication bias, but when they actually powered, so they went and got even larger sample sizes, and then they tried to reproduce these findings. This is kind of the distribution that they saw in p-values. So this was, again, very problematic that all of these studies, which were in the literature, have already been published. When you actually try to replicate them, you could not find the same p-values that you found in the original papers. And that began what a lot of people talk about as being the psychology crisis. So what happens if we have all of these published papers suggesting their phenomena is true, but we can't actually replicate any of the findings that are in these published studies, or we replicate very few. Some are replicated, but as you can see, it's very few compared to the ones that are actually published. So this kind of began this whole review in psychology and medicine. Actually, medicine equally has a difficult problem with this, of saying, look, we've got an issue and we have to do something about that. So what is pre-registration? Well, pre-registration is this attempt to say it's, and I like to call them lab notebooks, that we're going back and saying, you're going to write down your hypotheses, why you're there, why this is an important question, and then you're going to detail everything along the way so that if you had to hand this notebook off to somebody, they could take your study and find exactly the same thing if they just followed your recipe or your lab manual on how you did that. And so that's what pre-registration is attempting to do. It's saying we want to get all of the decisions down, and we actually don't care what your decisions are. That's up for reviewers to figure out. But for pre-registration, we want you to put all of the decisions you're going to make prior to you ever looking at the data. So this needs to be, you've made all of these decisions prior to collecting or looking at the data. And I say that about looking at the data because I do secondary data analysis. Other people use existing data as well. You don't want to look at the data you're going to be doing the analyses on prior to doing a pre-registration. So what does it give you? It gives you this time-stamped read-only version of your research plan where you can begin before you begin your data collection. It has your hypotheses, data collection procedures, manipulated and measured variables, what statistical model you're going to be using, and your inference criteria. Right? Many people at this point say, wow, that sounds a lot like what I had to do for my master's thesis or my dissertation. It is exactly that. It's going back and being thoughtful at every single stage about why you're making the decisions that you're making along the way. And I do want to know, because a lot of people get concerned that you can't change your decision. That's not true. You can always put in a correction or an adaptation when you've run into something that you didn't think you were going to run into and you had to make a decision. The issue is to always write down when you made a decision that may impact the paper that you wrote, and is important for both reviewers and anyone trying to replicate your study to know, so that they can know why their replication may differ from what you found. So here in the research plan, one of the things that we talk about is a registered report. A lot of people get that confused with pre-registration, but a registered report, the advantage is actually that you get peer review right after you have your question and design study, and before you collect and analyze your data. Right now, the way we do peer review is after you write the entire paper, then we do the peer review. But for registered report, it's putting down, why is this an important question? Why do people think this is interesting? What is going to be your design? How are you going to collect the data? What is going to be your statistical model for using when you do this? Then you send that out for review. And if you make it through stage 1, then they tell you go ahead and collect the data and analyze it and do it exactly the way you said you were going to do it. And if you do that, well, then it will be published. And it doesn't matter if it's null findings or significant findings. If this was a great idea and you designed it the way that you should in order to answer the question, and you analyzed it correctly, then no matter what the outcome is, this paper will be published. And that differs from pre-registration, which is that you just pre-register all of that, you write the paper, and you do our normal kind of stage 2 peer review. So again, a lot of people get confused between these two. Pre-registration is different than the registered report. So what are the kind of problems that pre-registration can fix? So, and I'm just going to add an extra one in here, that it makes us slow down and think about our science. Instead of getting data, running a bunch of data, and then writing a paper and having no idea kind of what it means. So it makes us slow down. Psychology and medical research has been moving too quickly, kind of constantly on this publication treadmill, and not very thoughtful about how what they're doing fits in to answering their questions. But one of the things that helps is with this file drawer effect. And what does that mean? That means that we have a lot of studies that we've done that did not find significant findings, and they've never seen the light of day. So in someone's lab, if you think about the research you've done, how many times did you write a paper that didn't get accepted? How many times did you do a study that you didn't find? You put it to the side, and then the other percentage are the ones that actually got published. What is that percentage? And we don't know what that is for any given group, for any given lab. So in that way, we don't actually know, for somebody who studies the same outcome or the same independent variables or both, we don't really know what the effect truly is. All we know is this published effect. We don't know the non-published effect. P-hacking, so this unreported flexibility in data analysis. And what that means, and I want to really stress unreported, is that you don't have it listed down. You did lots and lots of analyses that you didn't tell people that you did. You only isolated, maybe you did lots of different modeling and you said, oh no, but this was the best model I had it. And you talk about it as if that's the only model that you looked at. So we don't know how many times you generated through the data analyses. So it's unreported. If you're doing exploratory analyses, you can report how many times you've done something. Again, just so that everybody knows what you've done. P-hacking is when it's unreported and looks like you only did one analysis. And then harking, which I also spoke about, hypothesizing after the results are known. So not going back and changing your front end or changing your hypotheses to line up with what you found versus having the hypotheses and not finding what you found. And as you see in these little circles, it's basically that you should go hypotheses to data set. Then after you find what you've pre-registered, then you have a new question. And then you go back and you hypothesize, which is the way it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be, here's my data, and now I'm going to find out, I'm going to answer the question and then go back and write it as if I always knew what the answer was going to be. Pre-registration makes a distinction between confirmatory hypothesis testing and exploratory hypothesis generating research more clear. And I can't stress this enough, because every time I present, people are like, oh, but what about being able to explore? I do data science, so a lot of people are like, our models are exploratory models. That's right. You say you have exploratory models. Often what I do is I have a percentage of the data that I explore, and then I confirm on the other part of the data. So like 80-20, explore on 20%, confirm on 80%. That has always been an okay way to think about your data, especially if you're going into an area that you don't really have good hypotheses about. But I will be very clear that my bias has been, and I've seen it, most people are going in with what should be really clear research questions and hypotheses, because they're coming from a literature that they just wrote about in their background section that says, this is what my hypothesis should be. But then they're going and doing basically exploratory analyses and then not telling us that that's what it is. Presenting these exploratory analyses as if they're confirmatory. And one other thing with our sharing statistics is almost all of those are hypothesis testing statistics. So anybody who's using t-test or regression, those are based on hypothesis testing. They're not based on exploratory data analyses. So they're supposed to be hypothesis first, followed by the way that you do your statistics. Again, this is kind of the context of confirmation. You do your traditional hypothesis testing or research question. The results are held to the highest standard or rigor. Goal is to minimize these false positives. And then you actually can interpret what your p-values mean. Is that strong? Is it weak? Is it something that's useful? You look at your effect sizes. Is this going to mean something for a small percentage of the population or a larger percentage? But in this context of discovery, it pushes knowledge into this data-led discovery, finds unexpected relations. Again, the p-values here in exploratory data that may not actually mean anything to us, because what we're trying to do is find out if there's something there. But we can't interpret those p-values if we find them, because it wasn't hypothesis testing. We were just exploring the data, and we're trying to discover what would then be our research question or hypotheses. Again, this is just kind of the distribution of how to think about, create a pre-registration, collect your new data. You go through a confirmation phase. And then in the discovery phase, what you would do is you would think about, you would look at it, you would explore your data, you would find interesting things, and then you would do a hypothesis generating. You would say, what's my research question? What's my hypothesis? And then you would go back and create a pre-registration. So that's kind of how the exploratory fits. You don't kind of pre-register until you know kind of what you want, but you tell us that you had explored the data. You don't go back and forth between these two. Again, the whole point of pre-registration is really to detail how you did your study. And that's what we want to know. How did you do your study so that it can be replicated and that we know how rigorous it was done? Like, did you do the kind of things I would expect to see? Did you handle outliers in a way that I think is a good way to handle them so that you don't bias your data? That falls on me as the reviewer to say that, but I need to know what you did in order for me to be able to say this is a really strong finding. I wanted to say that a lot of people are like, oh, but is there just one pre-registration form and it doesn't really fit my data? No, there's tons of pre-registration forms. And when you get these slides, you'll be able to click into there. So we have, the regular pre-registration. We have those that do open-ended and qualitative pre-registration. We have a short one, which is as predicted. We have the secondary data pre-registration, which I worked on. We have the registered report protocols, cognitive modeling, fMRI pre-registration, OpenStats Lab, and Project here. So there are lots, and people are generating new ones each time that the pre-registration for their area of research doesn't really match kind of the existing one, which is more of an experimental one, which is problematic for me because I do correlational ones, which is why I worked on the secondary data pre-registration. So if you don't find one that fits your research, one can always work together to create one and put them on the Center for Open Sciences. I just wanted to show, does it matter if you pre-register? A lot of people are like, yeah, so everyone's telling me I need to pre-register, but come on, is it really making a difference? And I just wanted to show you this slide that's from Schaefer and Schwartz that looked at that very question. And so as you can see here to the right, with pre-registration, how often did you find something that was large, medium, and small? These are the Jacob-Cohen benchmarks that a lot of people use. And these are without pre-registration. And you can see that there's a significant change in how the effect sizes that are found, with much smaller effect sizes being with pre-registration, which is likely to be the case. And then you can kind of see across these different areas, and here's educational, about what is the typical effect size that you would expect. And they're quite a bit lower than you often see in published papers. I see effect sizes that I'm like, that's improbable, totally improbable to have a 0.80 effect size for that. Otherwise, if you did that thing, that would be exactly what your outcome would be. And that's just not the complicated nature of either psychology, medicine, education, or any of these areas of research. This is just following this up, showing you the kind of between subjects design, the within subjects design, and kind of the differences between studies that were pre-registered with those that weren't pre-registered. You find, again, differences in how different they look, as far as like the kind of mean differences you find on exactly the same thing. This is why we can't replicate studies, because without the pre-registration, we have an entire just heterogeneity across all of these areas that we're finding with both between subject and within subject designs. So thank you. I hope I didn't go too quickly, but I hope I gave you just a general overview of the pre-reg so that my other presenters will be able to tell you specifics.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Davis-Kean. We did get a couple questions. Some of them I will save for the end, but a few I'll go ahead and ask you now, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm just going to keep this up in case anybody asks me about a slide specifically.
Okay. Gotcha. So someone asked about the approval process and how long does it take, and can they continue their study pretty much while they are waiting for that pre-registration approval?
So for that would be for a registered report. For pre-registration, there is no, you're just supposed to do it before you ever collect data. So there's no time restriction on the pre-registration, but on the registered report, you are not allowed to collect data until you actually get approval for the stage 1 registered report. Then you're allowed to go kind of collect data. So that, I mean, the assumption is you're putting it in, awaiting to get the review. And then once you do, you can go ahead and collect the data at that time. We just did registered report secondary data. You don't pull any of that data from the source that you're going to be getting it from until you get approval for the stage 1. Then you pull that data. So for registered report, you shouldn't be doing anything regarding the data until you get the approval of the first one. Pre-registration is a totally different thing. There's no time limit to what you're doing.
Gotcha. And just to be clear, you can use register reports and pre-registration for all types of studies, not just quantitative. So it can be qualitative or meta-analysis.
It can be, yeah. And that's why there's a qualitative pre-registration. So, I mean, again, it's all about doing science, both qualitative, quantitative, any way that we look at it, that you're stating your assumptions, your questions, your biases upfront before you actually do any analyses, whether it's qualitative or quantitative.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you so much. And for time purposes, I'm sorry, we will have to move on to our next presenter. And then after that, we'll have a few more questions for everyone to answer as a group. So I believe it's going to Jessaca Spybrook, correct? There we go. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Amber. Let me just get this going real quick here. Okay, great. Thanks. So, and thanks to Pam for giving a great overview. So I think this talk is going to segue really well because I'm going to hone in on one specific option for pre-registration, and it's geared specifically towards education studies. So what I'm going to talk about is the Registry of Efficacy and Effectiveness Studies, which is kind of a mouthful. So we'll just call that REESE. And REESE was originally funded by a grant from the Institute of Education Sciences to the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness. After the first grant, SREE joined forces actually with ICPSR at the University of Michigan for a second grant from IES to provide further support of REESE and to establish a home for REESE at ICPSR. So my talk today is really based on this collaborative effort between folks at SREE and folks at ICPSR. So let's start with kind of a good first question, and that is, what is REESE? So specifically, REESE is a public database of impact studies. So Pam talked about how we can pre-register lots of different types of studies, which is very, very true. I'm specifically talking about an opportunity or a place to register impact studies or studies that are seeking to make causal inferences. So for example, a study that might be seeking to assess whether the effect of a new tutoring intervention improves math achievement, or whether a whole school reform model leads to changes in school behavior or school climate. So REESE is also a domain-specific registry, and right now it is specific to education. And so that means that we use language that is really familiar to folks who are planning impact studies in education. And this was done really intentionally in an effort to make it easier for folks to think about registering their studies. I have on here pre-registration and retrospective registration. So my focus today is going to be on talking about pre-registering studies, but it should be also kind of mentioned that you can use REESE for retrospective registration. So there are some cases where, you know, perhaps after the fact to get the study out more, you might want to add that to a registry. And so it does accept pre-registered or retrospective studies. So now that we know what it is, a next question is, okay, so what does a REESE entry include? And this really gets into the details of what kind of information, as Pam talked about, like in a, you know, you think of it as your lab notebook, what kind of information do we want to include and put out into the public domain? So in REESE, it includes 8 different, a REESE entry includes 8 different sections, starting with the first one, which is basic study information. So this is kind of what we would think of as your grant details, right? Contact information, funding agency, award number. One of the things you'll see on there is timing of entry. So that really gets at, is this a pre-registration? Because we want to be able to distinguish between those that are pre-registered versus retrospectively. In addition to the general study information, the second section really gets into kind of description of your particular study details. So here is an opportunity to, you know, talk about the interventions, talk about the design of your study in terms of, you know, I have 1 treatment versus 1 comparison, 2 treatments versus 1 comparison. Again, the focus here is specifically on impact studies. And to spell out a little bit more about where the study is taking place and what these different conditions look like. So again, section 1 and 2, you know, I kind of think of these as like overall study information here. And where I think it gets to kind of the really fun part, I would say, starts in section 3, where here we start to get into the details of your research design and analysis plan. So beginning with delineation of confirmatory and exploratory questions. And this follows, you know, right on from what Pam was saying, that we need to explicate these at the beginning. So I want to say, these are my confirmatory questions. And in REESE, actually you have the opportunity to include exploratory questions or not. So there's no follow-up of exploratory questions because, you know, sometimes those would emerge later on. But we do ask specifically for confirmatory questions to be delineated, and then we ask follow-up information on those questions. So after the questions are there, we specifically ask details about the study design. So trying to understand, you know, what is the design that is going to go into the field. So REESE accommodates 4 kind of broad categories of design. So randomized trials, quasi-experiments, regression discontinuity designs, and then single case designs. And we kind of think of that as like the first level of design, right? So it starts there, and then we hone into specific details to try to further categorize the design. So for example, asking questions about, okay, you know, what's the unit of assignment? So do we have a, you know, we imagine a randomized trial. Do we have a single level randomized trial, or do we have a cluster randomized design? What does the structure or the hierarchy look like, so that we can really kind of pinpoint the exact design that's going into the field? Section 5 continues with this, and so pushes on, okay, you know, we've identified what the design is. We know, you know, there's maybe 1 treatment, 1 comparison arm, for example. Tell us about the sample sizes. So, you know, how many students are, if you have an example of, you know, maybe a school-based study, so how many students are in each school? How many schools are in each condition? Really trying to get at the specific features of a particular design. In addition, asking questions related to the inclusion and the exclusion criteria for, you can imagine, students or schools or whatever your units are. The sixth section gets into the specific outcomes, and it's important to note that these are tied back to your research questions, right? So if you have a particular, if you have 3 confirmatory research questions, for example, then we're going to ask you about the outcomes associated with each of those research questions. So wanting to know, what's the outcome domain? What is the name of the outcome measure? How is it that you're going to assess this particular outcome? What type of outcome? The last thing on there is, we are interested in a sense of the statistical power of this for the study. And for that, it's not just for the study, but it's specific to particular research questions and particular outcomes. So we ask for each of the outcomes that are identified, okay, what's the minimum detectable effect size for that particular outcome for that particular question? The 7th section then gets into the details of the analysis plan. So this is your opportunity to talk about the planned analysis. So to talk about what baseline data is going to be collected, what covariates are going to be included in the model, what is the model, quite frankly, that's a big question. Some folks, REESE offers the opportunity to put your model right in there. Some folks prefer to upload that as an attachment because they have a lot more details they want to include about their model, which is great too. And then a few questions about, how are you handling missing data? How are you handling multiple comparisons? And really, in many ways, it's a trigger to folks as well to, hey, I got to think about these things before I start my study. And the last section is additional materials, which is an opportunity to upload things like your analytic models and your plans, a logic model that goes with your impact study, a fidelity measure. Whatever you would feel fit and you feel like would be appropriate is definitely welcome there. So now that you kind of know what's in an entry, I want to talk for a minute about some of the features that make REESE a little bit different from some of the other registries that exist, and kind of why some of these features exist. So first thing, this is common across several different registries, but it is built as a web-based interface with the intent of trying to make this a quick and easy process. So we certainly recognize that pre-registration is an additional step that folks have to take. But the idea is that a well-designed and thought-out study actually should work itself quite nicely into a pre-registration because we're asking questions that you've already thought about and already have in your plan. One of the features about REESE that is a little bit unique is that it looks for categorical responses to questions whenever possible. So I give you a little sample here, the question about the study design. So the first question is, okay, first of all, just select that broad category. And part of the reason that we really tried to use these categorical responses is for consistency in language, because oftentimes in a narrative response, folks may be talking about the same thing, but don't actually recognize that they're talking about the same thing because they're using different language. And so it can be hard to make connections across studies in sometimes with those narrative responses. And so as much as possible, responses are elicited in these with these categorical options. As Pam mentioned, a key feature in any registry and a key feature in REESE is the ability to chronicle changes. And so we all know, we've done field studies. Anyone who has participated in a field study knows that things are going to change. Take COVID, for example. Plans went out the window in many school-based studies. And so writing down and describing these changes to your study plan is crucial. And so in REESE, you go in and you update your entry, and then you also provide a narrative about, kind of explaining these changes, why they took place, and what the potential next steps are. And for folks who are viewing your registry entry, they can actually see any version. So they could see the original version, they could see, a second version, they could see a third version. And so it's really an opportunity to tell exactly what happened in your study. there is a searchable database, and I think that, you know, this is particularly aided by the fact that we have these categorical responses. So the design, these categories kind of on the left-hand side of the search the registry screen, you know, you can search by design category because a person had to select that design category. And so those discrete responses really make it easier to find, for example, you know, studies of science interventions for elementary schools that utilize randomized trials. And so it really can help it make it easier for folks to find these studies. In addition to searching, you know, kind of widely across studies, the output that comes with that is a PDF of individual studies. So you can get the detail for a particular study, or you could ask for, in various forms, we can give you databases, a database across multiple entries or across whatever we've got. So you can get that in various forms if you're interested in a broader search. So we are, I'm going to turn it over at this point. I'm not sure if Amber is going to want to take a couple questions now, but again, if you have questions later, happy to answer them with follow-up emails.
Yes, thank you so much. I will just ask one question. Me and Dr. Kean were able to, Dr. Davis-Kean were able to answer quite a few, but the one I had about REESE was, is it only intervention studies?
That's correct. So REESE at this point, eventually we would like to expand it, but at this point it is specifically for intervention studies. Intervention studies,
okay, gotcha. And if there's any questions that I see that were directed towards you, I'll be sure to try to bring them up in the Q&A. But I do want to give Dr. Katharine Meyer enough time to present her slides now. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and get these loaded up and so that everybody else can see them and so that I can see them too.
Oh, that looks good. Yep.
Excellent. Great. Thanks so much. So I'm really excited to talk about how pre-registration has worked in practice for me. I'm Katharine Meyer. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University, and I study a lot of questions about the transition from high school to post-secondary options, a lot of that in the context of randomized control trials. And so pre-registration has been a really useful tool for me to design good studies that are going to get at the questions I'm interested in. And so hopefully I can focus my presentation on how pre-registration is good for the scholarly community, but also for individual researchers. I really think of pre-registration as the greatest research gift you can give yourself. So as we've talked about, we have this sense of this maybe overly simplified linear path of research. And we've talked about kind of how pre-registration can fit into this. And I think what's important to acknowledge is that we have this idea about this very linear process of conducting the research and gathering, you gather the data, you run the analysis, you write the report, but that in reality can often have this sort of messy, iterative feel to it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a lot of the joy of research, is gathering information at one point in the study, reflecting on your initial hypotheses, thinking about the data you initially collected, brainstorming ideas for new studies. It's the true joy of research, is to be able to engage in this iterative, non-linear, this sort of, this messy-ish approach, but to constantly be reflecting. And I think it's important at this point to talk about how pre-registration isn't trying to necessarily remove that joy of exploration from the research process. But again, like Jessica and Pam talked about, just making sure that you're documenting how that's playing into the analysis, so that that's written down somewhere, so that other researchers can understand what you're doing, so that you can understand the process that you're going through as well. I think we've talked a lot about how pre-registration really builds on things you're probably already doing if you're trying to put together good science. You want to start outlining your hypotheses, and you want to outline what your exploratory and confirmatory hypotheses are at the beginning. But to make that a really living document that you can reflect on, it needs to be more than just saying it out loud. I declare this is my hypothesis. And that often you're already developing these tools as sort of lab documents or putting together presentations to work with partners about things like, this is what the intervention will look like. This is the sample size I'm anticipating. And these are the sort of relationships we think are going to be most relevant in this context. This is information that you should kind of already be putting together. And the benefit of a formal registry like REESE, which I've used, and I'll talk through some examples, or any other registry, is just sort of formally stating those. And in particular for REESE, I find the benefit is this sort of guided process, looking at sort of step-by-step in the analytic design to take these thoughts that you have, again, in lab notebooks or written on the board or on Post-it notes and putting it together in one easily accessible location. And so again, thinking through, even though research doesn't always have this linear approach, but thinking through the steps in the research where pre-registration is going to be most beneficial and where I've certainly benefited in some specific studies. I think first, just reflecting on something Jessica said about the searchable nature of REESE, is that it's a really great way to identify the studies that are going on right now in areas that you care about. It's very easy to go and search and see, are there other interventions going on for third grade science and mathematics or something like that, to just get a sense of the lay of the land. So I think that's something that isn't as often highlighted as a benefit from pre-registry, but that's an incredible resource that as enough of us are uploading our studies, it becomes a really valuable place to start some of your literature reviews, particularly given that these are studies that maybe haven't been published yet, but you still want to consider what's been done, what people are considering early on, after studies have been implemented. Even if they don't get published, there is this documentation of studies that we can look back on and think about what our contribution is that's building on what's been done in the past. I think the greatest benefit for me in pre-registering studies has been in the formulation of hypotheses. This next step of formally defining hypotheses and outlining research designs is probably what comes to mind when you're thinking about pre-registration. And this is typically when you fill out your pre-registration as well. It's the crucial step that sets you up for later success in the analysis. What I really like about REESE, and again, I think other pre-registry sites do this to a greater or limited extent, is it really helps you articulate a career research path from your abstract questions. So, I'm working on a randomized control trial that was based off a pilot that we ran that was not randomized, but we were sort of testing out concepts. We're going to then take, this intervention that we developed in that pilot, randomize it in a class and see what the effects are. And we're really fortunate. It's in the post-secondary context, working with a college class, and it's with an institution that has a wealth of data that they're willing to share with us. And so there are a lot of things we could look at. And sometimes I get overwhelmed with what a great problems have, overwhelmed with all of the potential outcomes. We could look at the final grade in the class, whether they remained enrolled in the class, the status of the homeworks that they submitted, these very micro proximal outcomes within the course itself. But we also have a partnership with the institution where we could see, did they major in the topic? Was their overall college persistence? There's a lot that we could look at. And what was really beneficial for me going through REESE was getting prompted to think carefully about these confirmatory research questions versus these exploratory research questions, and really naming for myself, what is the theory of change? What do I think that we are most directly impacting? How can I focus my analysis on this? Obviously, we think there's going to be the greatest effect on the more proximal course-related outcomes if it's intervention within a class context. And so that led us to highlight things like academic performance in the course, engagement in the classes, these sort of confirmatory research questions, while also naming and allowing ourselves the opportunity to both look at other outcomes that there's less of a tight theoretical link on, but that we might be able to see an impact on, and to also note some of the non-causal questions we're asking as well. It was a nice place to note that we'll also have these descriptive questions about engagement in the class among the treated group, for example. So it was a really nice framework to put those together. Particularly for me in sort of this RCT framework, the REESE section that prompts a power analysis really focuses the researcher on whether or not you're set up for success. Right? Are you going to have the capability to detect the sort of effects you outlined in the previous section? This is where you face the reality of the project, and hopefully you're doing this on your own. But again, pre-registration is just a way to force you to ask those tough questions and make sure that you're running your power analysis carefully, thinking about the steps that you need to take now as opposed to later. So in this example, I was talking through this RCT with a college class. We anticipated a larger enrollment class than actually, materialized once we got the list of students who had enrolled in the class and who were eligible for the messagings that we planned to send out. And so we got a minimal detectable effect size, and we calculated that. But it was nice to really reflect on this shift between what we anticipated originally and what we actually got in terms of signups. And we were able to then put into REESE a statement about we note that course enrollment was lower than we anticipated. We acknowledge that we may be underpowered, which is a deviation from kind of our original thoughts as putting together the intervention. And we could pre-register now that one thing we might do to deal with this is that look at the outcomes, look at the sort of directional indication we're getting there. And we may run another wave of the intervention in the spring, which we are going to do with the study. But it was nice to name that this was a plan now before we had even implemented the initial intervention, just to be able to go back and refer to that and let folks know, this was always a potential in the plan. Another really big benefit for me of pre-registration is the gift you give yourself of organizing your analysis ahead of time. I think too often data are coming in, they're sometimes in a confusing format, there's so much to look at, it can be really overwhelming for me where to start. And so I'm going to talk through in another study that I'm doing. I was actually brought in after the intervention had concluded. It was designed, my co-authors ran the intervention and a whole bunch of data came in. And again, it was with this institution that has a whole host of outcomes. And before I came in as sort of the new co-author who was going to be looking through the data, I was able to put in a pre-registration at REESE that's, this is after outcomes have been collected, but it is before I have had a chance to look at them. And it gave me a chance, this is the sort of fresh eyes in the intervention to, again, outline the potential outcomes that we had, start to put them into categories of what we're going to look at, think about the structure of the intervention. This was an instance where there were kind of targeted messages for targeted outcomes. And so to articulate in REESE, that was the structure of the intervention. And so we're going to have these sort of subset analyses based on the design of the intervention. And then lastly, I think the ultimate gift, again, that pre-registration gives you is that you've already thought through and you've written so much of the material you're going to use in your ultimate paper that it makes, maybe not piece of cake to write up the final results, but you've done so much of the legwork at the start that you're really well set up to put together a high quality paper quickly after you get to do the actual analysis. I know we're short on time, just some final thoughts about user tips, particularly with REESE. I think it's really helpful that it has this searchable database of existing pre-registrations. And I think other sites do, to just look and see how other folks are doing it to help you think through how to fill it out if it's your first time doing a pre-registration. I find it really helpful to prepare these attachments ahead of time for things like your analytic model, your power calculation graphs. Nice that REESE has the opportunity to upload those. Sometimes to work slowly, I think what's really strong about REESE is that it has this sort of conditional customized nature, that it will understand what you're asking in one section and tailor the questions in the next section to that. But you need to work slowly so that the computer can catch up with you. And also to just share and use your own pre-registration, not just let it sit on the registry, but I find it useful to have as a link on my website or on my CV so folks can see my works in progress, or, it's certainly great for referencing when you're putting together the paper at the end, but also when you're putting together things like conference proposals or grant proposals or stuff like that. So that's to try and leave some time for Q&As. That's where I'll end, but happy to answer any other questions here or via email, and happy registering to you all.
Thank you so much for that. I believe that all the presenters were able to jump in there and tackle the questions of our attendees. So I really appreciate you guys for doing that during the presentation. Again, the slides and the recordings will be shared to the email address that you use for registration. So please look out for those links after we get captioning and all of the things formatted correctly. We will send that to you all. We pushed right up against the time. So I think that if you all have any questions, please do reach out. You can use the agenda to find the names and the institutions where our presenters are. And they are very eager and willing to answer any questions that you have so that we can all tackle pre-registration and the replication sort of crisis that we're having in our research. So we can all tackle that together. So thank you for attending and for sticking around. I hope you all have a good rest of your week. All right, have a good one.